The goodwill of so many enables all of us to enjoy these thought-provoking and educational programs. Tonight, I would like to thank the Great Talk Gold sponsors, the Zaf McKinney Group at Morgan Stanley, and LifeBridge Health for their financial support, and a big thank you to the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute at Johns Hopkins University for being our longtime and close VIP partner. Thank you to our media co-sponsors, the Baltimore Fishbowl and the Baltimore Sun, for their support. We also are appreciative of the donations made by our generous supporters. Our program tonight is being held and hosted by the BWTech at UMBC South, and we are grateful for Marjorie Coda, Director of Entrepreneurial Services, for her support and help. Since we are also streaming this talk virtually, a big thank you goes to Andrew Eisenstadt, UMBC Virtual Events Specialist. And the two of them made this all happen, and we are very appreciative. I am pleased to announce that following our talk, the generous Glenmore Caterers have graciously provided refreshments for us, so please stick around and enjoy. Great Talk is an all-volunteer nonprofit organization which depends upon your tax-deductible donations to continue to make these programs available for free, like tonight's special program. Donations are always accepted. A recording of this event will be posted on YouTube, and updates on our future Great Talk events can be found on our website, greattalk.org. Well, tonight's topic is front and center, and it seems to involve everything we do these days. It especially has a big effect on our politics, and tonight we have just the right people to discuss social media, its effect on free speech, the news, and social norms, the profits and the trappings. I would like now to introduce tonight's panel. Our moderator, Dr. Mark FELDSTEIN. UMD Chair, Richard Eaton, Broadcast Journalism, recipient of more than 50 journalism awards for his exposés, and as a worldwide investigative correspondent for CNN and other major networks. Often on site at the risk of his own life, he was the news for being beaten badly up in Egypt on a special assignment, and he is highly respected as a scholar, the author of Poisoning the Press, and as the international media expert and analyst. Our panelists, Dr. Jennifer KEOHANE, University of Baltimore Director of the Digital Communication Program and Associate Professor overseeing the General Education Program in Oral Communication. Dr. KEOHANE is co-founder of the Innovative Research Lab, Character Assassination, and Reputation Politics. And her remarkable studies of social movements were followed by her book, Feminist Voices and Communist Rhetoric in Cold War America. Dr. Elizabeth NEWBURY, Director of the Wilson Center Serious Games Initiative, and she's the leader for the ingenious use of the game's social platform to engage the public in policy research for the communication of science, policy, and social good. Her federal budget games have been played worldwide by over 3 million people. Dr. NEWBURY is the chair of Federal Games Guild with over 100 participating agencies. And Dr. Lance Young-Ying Park, Howard University professor of the Communications School and Harvard University faculty associate, and was a fellow at Princeton University for Technology Policy. Dr. Young is the recipient of numerous and prestigious grants and writing awards. His critical book, The Future of Digital Surveillance, examines AI appetite for data and social media. His current research focuses on how to counter the bias of the AI algorithms and data resulting in social inequities through information consumption. We all have some time for Q&A after our talk. And I now would like to introduce Dr. Mark FELDSTEIN, who will begin our discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you to all of you who've come out tonight, especially it's such a beautiful day. I know we're competing with the weather, and we are grateful for your presence. So let me, when we think about social media, I at least tend to think about Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, or X. But let's take a step back and ask a really basic question. How do you define social media?
Yeah, I can take that one. So social media is, broadly speaking, media forms that are interactive, dynamic, and a network of connectivity. So when you say Facebook, it's a way of connecting with your friends. Twitter or X is an information sharing network, also a social media network. I actually want to ask the audience really quickly, how many of you think of yourselves as social media users? And Facebook is a popular platform. Is that, okay, I'm seeing nods. Anyone on YouTube or TikTok? Okay. So it's just a really good example of there's a diversity of platforms, and each of them have different needs and uses when we're thinking about them. When we think about Facebook, it's again a way of connecting with your friends. Oftentimes, a lot of the ways that Facebook is structured are supposed to be focused on that sort of a dynamic. So you're connecting with relatives and keeping up with them. I know my mother-in-law and father-in-law are in here, and I think that they're exclusively on Facebook to see updates of their grandson and grandchildren otherwise. If you're on Twitter, oftentimes you're on there for Twitter, X, however you want to think about it now. It started out as an information sharing network where it was designed to be an agile, quick message that you could get out. And a lot of the research and studies that focused on it demonstrated that purpose. It's really a way of not necessarily sharing pictures of your grandchildren, although you can. It was more of a way of gathering information. But the most popular, does anyone know what the most popular social media site is? According to Pew, the one that we engage with the most is YouTube, which is a video network. And one of the reasons why it is so popular is people go back and forth throughout their day looking at YouTube videos. So that's largely, when we're thinking of social media platforms, it's good to think about them as not just a monolithic body of media, but that they have their each unique uses and ways that people tend to gravitate towards them.
I would just say too, one of the things that is interesting for me as a professor is to recognize the different demographics that tend to use the various platforms. I am not, for me, I use YouTube, but not continually, but I see my students on it constantly, and they talk about falling down YouTube rabbit holes. I spend a lot of time on Twitter or X, and if I'm just going to call it Twitter, but that's because I'm a news junkie, and I like the affordances, we might say, of that medium. I have never been on TikTok, but my students are on TikTok constantly, and so just like as Elizabeth was saying, thinking about what each platform allows you to do, I think it's useful to recognize that sort of different demographics gravitate toward these different platforms as well.
So if I add that, I agree with all the definition of social media. My definition of social media is a little bit different because I would actually say that social media is much more personal data surveillance machine. So that all the platform, despite all the differences, actually they actually connected with one activity, which is actually collecting the data.
And what's the product?
So the product is depending on who actually we think that is client is, but I think that it's a traffic mostly. Facebook define their business in terms of advertising. Therefore, their decision about how they collect the data is actually depending on how much actually they will actually increase traffic. So all the decision about content moderation, which is how much content is available given the user, is defined by their desire to actually increase traffic. Same thing as any other platform, I should say, such as YouTube. They have a lot of different suggestions and data collection actually goes. All that decision actually depending on traffic. So product they actually generate to selling to advertiser is a traffic.
We're the product as clients. We think we're getting a product for free, but the real product is our data.
Sure. Thanks for that. Actually, that's a better definition of the product. It is actually. By traffic, actually, we could actually say it's aggregate number of how many of us actually click on a certain issue. But I think that obviously the one that actually we provide is us freely by actually clicking the data or video, actually we sending all the data to them. Obviously, those data is freely available for them to actually use, to actually curate some kind of content much more friendlier to advertiser. So product is us, yeah.
You want to add anything to that?
Your definition,
So another big picture question. How has social media changed? I'm sorry? Okay. How has social media changed our society? Politically, economically, culturally, socially? Big question.
I'm sure we'll all have things to say about this particular topic. I think there are so many ways that we could take this question. And I'll start maybe by thinking interpersonally. Interpersonally. So about our relationships with other people. When social media first started, my dad always said, I don't want to know what you had for breakfast. Why would I get on social media, right? As a way to indicate that something is changing about our standards of disclosure, right? And the way that we think about who we're communicating to on social media is different than a lot of the ways that we had access to people before. And so certainly, as Elizabeth was saying, social media engenders connections, and how close or loose those connections are depends on the platform that we're talking about and what their requirements are for friending people and that kind of thing. And so I want to be clear that there's a lot of, I think, positive social connection that can come out of social media. At the same time, we've all heard the reports about online bullying. The Surgeon General released a report last year about the epidemic of loneliness that's striking our society. And certainly, I think part of that is an outgrowth of a really intense upheaval that came about because of the coronavirus pandemic. But in the Surgeon General's report, one of the things that they point to as action steps of things that we could or should do is to think about our digital environments, right? And to think about developing more pro-connection technologies. Data transparency is another part of all of this. One other thing I think that's useful to remember when we think about our interpersonal connections is the idea of emotional contagion. Many of you have probably heard of this big Facebook study that was controversial for a variety of reasons, shall we say. But in 2014, Facebook tinkered with all of our news feeds and was studying whether if they pushed positive updates to us or negative updates to us, what that made us more likely to post on our own. And I will say this was controversial because they didn't have our approval for doing that, except in like tiny little user agreements, which I think is, thinking about how and the rules of engagement on these platforms, what we agree to give away is important. But that study found that regardless of whether you interacted with the post, you didn't have to like it, you didn't have to comment, that the emotional contagion, the transferal of positive or negative emotions to you occurred. And so I think when we sort of scroll through our phones, sit on our laptops, we need to recognize sort of the barrage of stuff that is coming at us, and recognizing that has some emotional impact, right? I was actually literally yesterday in class, my students and I were talking about news, and they were admitting that they found platforms like Twitter very overwhelming for just kind of the constant barrage. So I'll say that, and then I'll say one more thing, which is that one of the other things I think that typically gets tossed around when we think about interpersonal connections on social media platforms is incivility and nastiness, right? And so we can think about reasons why this would be the case, right? You can post anonymously on Twitter, for instance, or have a username that doesn't match who you are, and it's incredibly difficult and challenging in defamation cases to try to unmask whoever it is that's hiding behind there. Likewise, so all of that is to say, I mean, we can understand why social media discourse can get so nasty. And again, I study character assassination in politics, and so it's clear, right, that things are nasty. I do want to put a caveat there, though, right? With my research lab, we've studied character assassination and found it in every culture and in every era that we have studied. So, like, I guess I say all of that as a way of saying, like, humans have always been pretty nasty to each other. You can go back to ancient Egypt, where they carved up the sarcophagi of the emperors when they were dead. You can think about Cicero and Catiline on the floors of the Roman Senate. They were incredibly nasty to each other. If you've seen the musical Hamilton, you also know that Hamilton penned this massive pamphlet about why John Adams was the worst guy ever. So I say all of that as a way of saying, like, humans have always found ways to be incredibly unkind to each other. The thing that social media adds, and I think makes this a little bit different when we think about incivility, both in politics and interpersonally, is again the idea that social media allows you to anonymize your attacks. And second, that social media democratizes the ability to attack, right? You don't have to own a printing press now. You don't have to be able to buy airtime. Instead, all you have to do is find something that's going to go viral, and you can launch those attacks. And so I tossed a lot out there for consideration, just in terms of thinking about how relationships have changed and society has changed in social media. But maybe that'll get us started thinking and talking about some of these topics.
Okay, great. So that, I think, is an excellent exposition on interpersonal changes that have happened, and we touched on politics. What else? What else has changed? How else has social media transformed our society?
Well, I want to pick up on a thread that Jennifer put down towards the end there, is that the discussions and worries that we have about social media. So, for example, the youths today and the TikToks, and they get sucked in and they can't find their way out. Those sort of considerations of immersion, obsessive use of a medium have always been also the case. So we have a saying in communication theory where it's the same concerns, but a new medium for them. Fun fact, when fiction books first came out and were widely published, there was also a concern that the kids today were going to be lost in these fantasy worlds and lose track of reality. So just as a context for social media, that is something to keep in mind. That doesn't mean that what's happening on social media and our concerns with it aren't unfounded, potentially. So, like, bullying online or not losing track of time, like, those are things that the mediums themselves facilitate. the flow of them, the like immersion and getting lost in the social media algorithm, your students going down into a YouTube hole. But I think that one of the things that we just have to bear in mind is that when we're thinking of these concerns, that they are ones that we've echoed for other technologies as well.
Right. Comics books at one point where there, and television, there's a lot of concerns about that. But there is a ubiquity to cell phone that people carry with them. And, we all see people walking down the street and they're not looking where they're going, right? They're looking at their phones.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that there is a change because of the social media. Is a modality of how we actually access the information and connect to the people that we used to know. So I came from the South Korea originally a long time ago. I'm living in this country almost 26 years now. And now I forgot all the high school buddy, but now because of the Facebook, despite all the problem, I could connect with them. But when I actually connect with them, it's pretty much the one that actually I used to talk, although it was a long time ago. So a lot of things actually changed, but at the same time, a lot of things are not actually changed. In a personal context, it's like that. And then if we actually bring up the very big issue, such as democracy. So going back to early 2000, there was a pretty big hype about social media, Arab Spring, and even actually all the U.S. actually movement about all that is actually pretty excited about all. But if we actually go back and then see that how much actually changed from that time on, and now because of the social media, I think that, again, depending on what we actually look, but if we actually look at such as democracy or people's connection, or how we actually connect with the new people, all those kind of is relatively stay the same.
Okay. Anything else in terms of the transformation of our society by social media? I mean, economically, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the creation of these billionaires who seem to be seem to answer to no one, or maybe their shareholders. Politically, the ramifications are huge. You started to touch on that, Jennifer, with character assassination. Anybody want to say anything more about those two fields?
So, I mean, character assassination, which is, I have no idea about. Although, I could actually guess. But some people actually put it as disinformation or misinformation or malinformation with the intention to actually harm the reputation of, certainly in your cases, I think there's political candidate or politician, especially the woman, female politician. So I think that those things are getting easier to actually attack, as actually Jennifer actually mentioned. Not only that, actually it's disseminate so quickly. And so again, the modality of kind of information, whether it's good or bad, is so easy. So it becomes like one person actually doing that is almost look like pretty big number of the people actually siding with those kind of attack, which is television era. It used to be very difficult because television is owned by pretty much a billionaire or millionaire, and local television station would not actually let you actually do those kind of thing. But these days, not really. By the way, actually, television station looking at the social media, how the information actually circulated these days, not television station to the social media. So the impact is there.
Here we go. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting because obviously, as someone who studies political communication, the debate about whether President Trump's tweets were newsworthy was something that sort of bubbled throughout, and I'm sure you know this as well, some of my friends who are journalists, right? And so, we, in the early days of social media, something would happen in the world, get covered on the news, and then circulate through social media. But now you're right, it's totally a bi-directional type of influence. I assume we're going to talk more about sort of fake news and stuff
We are.
in a bit. So maybe I'll share some of what I was going to say about that. But certainly, as we're thinking about social norms and engagement and connecting with old friends, and I do want to be clear, especially in, not that the internet is free and fair in all authoritarian countries and that kind of thing, but I don't want to downplay the role that social media has in countries where information does not flow as freely as it might here, and recognizing that in countries where an independent press is not something that exists, that social media has a really powerful and potentially positive net impact as well. One other thing I think I'll say as we're kind of thinking about us and like people behind the screens here is just to recognize as well that like those dopamine hits that we get when people like our stuff and retweet our stuff, like that's real, and that requires reckoning with, right? And we can talk about some of the studies that have been done on that specifically related to fake news. So maybe I'll stop there, but recognizing that like, these platforms are built to keep us sharing and to keep us reacting and to keep us engaging. And like that makes our brain feel dopamine, right? And so, the outrageous stuff, the emotional stuff, the crazy stuff is what goes viral. And aren't we all at the end of the day just maybe hoping that we'll get our turn to go viral once a little bit, maybe? It's because we want that. Like that's a reward. It's feedback from the people out there that they want to hear what I have to say. So I think, recognizing the sort of reward structures that are built into social media is another thing that happens as we're thinking about making friends and following people and posting cute dog pics and that kind of thing.
Digitizing Andy Warhol's comment about we all want 15 minutes of
Exactly.
fame, maybe 15 seconds now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, things move so quickly.
Well, let's talk about sort of the specific topic for today, in particular social norms. So how is social media affecting social norms? We sort of touched on cyberbullying and personal interaction, but how are the standards different now? How have we changed as a society in what we expect and accept thanks to social media?
So I think one thing that we expect, and I think it's trended through this conversation, is that everyone is posting to social media or accepting of social media. I want to be cognizant that several people in the room in particular didn't raise their hands when they said that they weren't on a social media platform. There is a long-standing idea that not everyone is an active contributor onto these social media platforms. Even if you are on a social media platform, you may just be listening. There was a great study by Nancy Bames several years ago that sort of started this trend, where it was looking at how people on forums may not be an active contributor but are listening. So I think one social norm that has changed is our awareness of even peripherally digesting this sort of information in a continuum of constant awareness. It's the, as the young people today say, the fear of missing out of something that's trending. A lot of early social media research focused on that from like a news aggregation, particularly with Twitter, how that was used to signal everything from earthquakes to, you mentioned, Arab Spring. But there's also just the casual day-to-day, oh, did you see so-and-so's post about their breaking up with their ex, or that sort of thing. There's also a flip side of what information is appropriate to share on various mediums. So I was in graduate school, I participated in a study of Twitter where we asked people on the streets of New York and in malls how they it was a question of like the perceptions of privacy online. But the idea was, what do you feel like is private information and what do you feel like is public, and what do you choose to post and why? And part of the onus was, I don't like, if I'm not going to post that I'm skipping work because I don't want my boss to see, for example. And I would never post medical information online. But when you showed them actual tweets of like have the flu today, gonna stay home sick, they're like, oh yeah, that seems like something that somebody would post. Yeah, that's fine. Not seeing that that was medical information. So I think the contextualization of this, and to bring it to a point, is that as far as social norms have changed, what is transparent information that we are willing to share in the same sense of like standing on a table in the cafeteria and shouting it out has slightly changed. But I want to be very cognizant of the fact that not everybody buys into that change of a social norm. There are people who actively don't post that information because it is private information to them.
Sure. I mean, that is excellent point, actually, that the privacy, how much actually we think that it's okay or even expected to share it. The extent of information that expected of me is greater than any other time, I think. There is a lot of information that my student is trying to actually connect, sometimes with some kind of Instagram feed and so on. And how much we think that there's boundary that we think there's teacher and student, there is a public kind of boundary. But nowadays, because of social media, we have to really renegotiate those kind of line. How much is it really acceptable for me to actually post, given some of my graduate students is there, which is sometimes really the issue that I have to think about, because it's during the colleague discussion, it could be actually, we could actually chat about the student is behaving like this, is beyond that. But I think that those kind of things is some faculty is willing to share, which is to my shock. So again, those kind of things is changing, but I don't know how much we actually settle on this is appropriate or not. I think it still actually is evolving. Yeah.
Yeah, my advisor at Cornell had a really good rule of not friending undergraduates, and she would explain it's for their protection, because you don't want her to know that you've been out partying all weekend, for example, and see those photos.
So yeah, to keep that record, some of the grad students actually come to after the graduation. That seems, once you are actually the advisor of the student, you feel like you are always the teacher in that certain level. So again, those kind of things is erase a lot of public and private boundary. I think that's something that definitely different when we're actually doing in the public sphere. Although as you mentioned, throughout the history of the communication technology, telephone actually raised similar issue, because how much private conversation, when actually telephone actually comes in, it's not just we connect to each other, we always go to the call center and somebody actually hook it up. So early days, they actually fear that somebody in the between actually here, and or the dating, or the courtship, because of telephone, because of the private information now freely shared. Similar concern was there.
I appreciate that point, because I think it's definitely the case that the boundaries between what's public and what's private are sort of still being negotiated. And that bleeds over beyond social media into things like email and texting and that kind of thing. It seems to me as a professor that students think that I am more likely to believe that they are sick the more graphically they describe their symptoms. And so the number of emails I get where I'm like, that was private, did not need to know that. And I'm certainly not suggesting that that is caused by social media, but I do think we live in a far more disclosive society than we have in the past. One other thing I'll say too about social norms, I observe the youth as I teach my classes and that kind of thing. And I walk into a classroom before classes start, and now everybody's on their phone. And they used to be, not always, but chatting with each other, having conversations. And I say all of this not as a way to like shame the youth, because I do the same thing, right? I get onto a train, or I walk into a meeting and I pull out my phone and I either answer emails or I scroll Instagram or what have you. But sort of the idea that we have these phones with our emails and our social media that are constantly with us. I think it has become socially acceptable to sort of hide behind that. And again, please, I recognize that a lot of social media discourse is another version of moral panic discourse, and I do not intend to suggest that it's all about the youths and they're ruining everything, because I do this too. It's just, it has become socially acceptable to use the phone, and I realize that's also proxy for a larger conversation about smartphones, not just social media, but thinking about the way that we are when we are out in public, I think has changed, right? We have our headphones in and we're listening to podcasts as we're walking around, or, talking on the phone and that kind of thing. And so I think stranger sociality is something that is changing in the wake of this technology as well.
I want to add one thing, maybe two. One thing that I think it also has helped us with is more of a global awareness. So trends and celebrities that we may not have been able to connect with without the help of social media and the vaster internets. I don't actually speak like this. I'm trying to be funny, just FYI. But the broader internet and the access to that sort of information, the flip side of that is on social media, as opposed to, say, just Googling for information. One thing we need to be aware is that social media it is filtered to us, and it's based on our preferences and past history on the platform and our social network that we've connected with. So I do think that there is a broader awareness to a certain extent through social media of this wider world. The other point that I wanted to add, though, is it has changed in our day-to-day, the performativity that we have. So classic example, I just came back from upstate New York, where we got to see clouds covering the eclipse. It was great. Historical moment. We did get to see totality, and like everything went dark, but it was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's great cloud cover. Thank you, Syracuse. But we did, looking around, one of the things that people were doing were capturing the moment to share with a broader network of people that they have, or I immediately sent pictures to my in-laws of the grandchild going, I don't know how to put these glasses on. What? He's only 18 months, so we give him a little slack. But I think there is also a changing social norm of performativity that has changed how we interact with just the day-to-day world.
Picture it didn't happen, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so we have social norms changing about self-disclosure, about performance. Some might call it exhibitionism, or what would have been regarded as exhibitionism in an earlier era. Interpersonal interactions. Lance, you wrote a book about digital surveillance, including social media and AI. Has social media changed our social norms about privacy and what we are willing to accept in terms of spying by powerful corporations?
Yeah, sure. We sort of touched upon that conversation. It actually, it has been consistent in terms of how much actually people worry about sharing the information. Going back to telephone, 1970s, 80s, and 90s, even earlier internet, those public survey data from the Pew and so on has three groups. One is doesn't care about the privacy or surveillance at all. And the other group is extremely concerned. And most of us belong in between. That has been very consistent. So again, I think that some of the expectation about personal and corporate side, if we actually talk to the younger generation, even they are somewhat, although it's not accurate version of it, somewhat aware there is something going on behind. But they cannot really pin down what it is actually they do with the data. So those things are actually expected even from the user and this is something that I think that everyone actually share. To actually do anything about the social media, to open an account, you have to agree upon. Let's say you don't agree with those kind of data privacy. Let's say somebody might say that then go to the other one. But the Facebook is the most gigantic social network. I cannot have those kind of choices, in fact. Instagram too, and WhatsApp, if you're actually coming from the international side, how much actually people are there, it value actually adding. So that about the surveillance, although most of us somewhat aware of it, I think that that's a little bit of challenge. But the concern side is always the same three group. So that has been going on. So I think that it's a mixed how much actually we expect and then give up.
Just to piggyback on that, I think that a lot of the concerns around privacy are impacted by what you're saying is that we don't know, thinking of like a day-to-day user, we don't know what the data is being used for necessarily. We know that it's in common speech now that we are, so like I'm fashioning a post for a mom group, for example, and I know as a user that if I put a picture into the post, it's more likely to get seen by others in the group. If I don't do that, then I will less likely get a response to my very important question about Miss Rachel / Bluey or whatever I'm posting to the mom group about. So we don't know why necessarily we do that. We just know that it works. And I think that there's a lot of need for education around unblackboxing or uncovering what these algorithms do or are asking for and why they ask for it. The other side of it is that even if we were to do that, one of the things that we as humans are really good at is just thinking about the immediate consequences. So back to my earlier point of, I wouldn't post that I'm skipping work because I'm worried that my boss would see it. I think that that would be, that sort of immediate impact is much more of a concern to a lot of users than it is like the long-term nebulous impacts of what does it mean for me to be part of this larger aggregate of data.
So let's turn a little bit and talk about free speech and how social media affects free speech. So you can now see violence live streamed on Facebook or other social media. Should that be allowed?
I'm going to say something very philosophical with the recognition that I am actively dodging your question. And that is that I think one of the things that we have to think about when it comes to social media and its relationship to free speech is the idea of sort of the town square of yore, right? And if you read, I'm not a lawyer, but I did used to teach a class in First Amendment law and communication ethics. So I know my law is sort of actually, my law knowledge is constrained to freedom of speech. Convenient. But, you know, one of the things that if you read First Amendment law throughout the ages that justices on the Supreme Court always prided or prized was the idea that a free flow of information in sort of a town hall, town square type thing was essential for democracy. And so I think the question becomes, is social media the new town hall, right? Is the town square now Twitter? And that raises a lot of interesting questions because obviously Twitter is not a place in the same way that a town square is. And Twitter is owned by a corporation. It is not public land, right? And so I say all of that as a way of saying, as we start thinking about political speech on the internet, reckoning with what social media is and how it works in our democracy, I think is a sort of philosophical question that we need to think about before we can kind of start getting into the should this be allowed? Should this not be allowed? And that kind of thing. I mean, people squawk about free speech on the internet all the time without realizing, of course, that the First Amendment protects you primarily from being censored by the government, not from consequences of your action or from corporations, right? Like, two different things, which isn't to say that social media platforms haven't also trumpeted the value of free speech. In fact, why Elon bought Twitter, right? But, thinking philosophically about what we want those spaces to do and how that relates to democracy, I think is an impossible question to answer, but a useful one to think about when we start getting into questions of content moderation, content neutrality, and all of that.
The excellent point. Going back to the violence, the picture, we could think about January 6th, the violence is politically significant in the U.S. context. How much that violence actually should be allowed or should be labeled in a certain way. Obviously, that's the kind of the discussion currently actually has been going in the Supreme Court and so on. So some of you might know that obviously Twitter, purchased by Elon Musk, is giving some kind of freedom interpreted literally without any intervention. But in the U.S. History of First Amendment, in fact, that was not the case. Freedom actually regulated in a very certain way, especially imminent danger and national security reason. And certainly, I think at least many of our colleagues would agree that the riot in January 6th is qualified as such. So that I think that even if a newspaper actually not disseminating, which actually belong to their right as a press, I think there's similar things actually going on about the social media, how much actually Twitter or Facebook actually deleting those kind of violence, which they believe is instigate the violence, further violence, and overturning the government. So issues are very complicated one, but I think that the violence is being, if I add one more, sorry, the violence in the history of the television regulation is pretty much well studied and justification. So it is because of the children access to the violence, because public actually seeing those kind of images has been a pretty good legal ground actually regulate the speeches. So.
Just to piggyback on January 6th, there is a whistleblower named Frances Hogan from Facebook who spirited off a bunch of documents, internal documents from Facebook, testified before Congress. And one of the things she said is that Facebook knowingly has algorithms that it knew promoted the violence on January 6th, that promote vaccine denial, that other things that are, yes, it's the public square, but it's being contaminated with disinformation, lies, and knowingly so that these companies can make money. So what do we do about that?
I think there's certain regulation. I think it's possible. Although Facebook and Google, whenever there is a problem such that they actually define their role in many different ways. Sometimes they say that they are a common carrier, which is work like telephone, so they just carry whatever the content is available. So that actually gives them some freedom to actually not to be actually sued by anyone else. But sometimes Google actually say that their editorial decision could be made. So they actually cut some of the information. The recent case about Texas actually has a state legislation that's saying that you guys, Google and Facebook, cannot regulate those kind of speech about Trump and so on. And then Google actually sued Texas saying that arguing they actually work like a newspaper. So they actually positioning whatever that worked for their advantage to make money. So obviously, going back to your point, obviously they could do more, but they're actually response to the traffic. And I think that everyone actually know in this panel is this information violence actually is a golden platform for them to actually generate the traffic. Therefore, they're not going to do much about it. That's why they actually say different role depending on the topic. Yeah.
Right. They want it both ways. They want to be a technology company when that helps them legally, and they want to be a media company when that helps them. I just like to say, for journalists, one of the ways journalists are kept accountable in journalistic news organizations is we get sued for libel, right? If we defame somebody, we can be sued for that and pay damages. But Congress passed an exemption for social media companies, Section 230, in the late 1990s, back when social media was an embryonic technology, and the thought was no bulletin board like Facebook could exist if they had to moderate the content and be responsible for everything some crackpot uploaded. But now what you have is no accountability often for what is posted. And for journalists, you know, we're supplying the content that they make money from, right? They're getting the ad revenue, and we're the ones getting sued. So how is that fair?
I will say, like, one of the things that's interesting to me as we think about regulating is to recognize that we are constantly, sorry, this is going to get meta for a second, and I don't mean like the company, I mean like sort of heady, but one of the things that the free speech debate requires us to reckon with is like, what is speech, right? And so again, we have to sort of think in metaphors because that's how the law works, right? Analogy and precedent is how legal reasoning works. But so, you know, do we want to treat social media platforms like a town square? Is speech generated by AI, is that actually speech deserving of First Amendment protection? Just a plug for a really excellent book by Jennifer Peterson. It's called How Machines Came to Speak. And she sort of reinvents the genealogy of the free speech story that most of us have told by looking not at what free means. You know, most discussions of free speech sort of focus on how what counts as free expanded and contracted over history. But she looks at it based on what counts as speech, right? And so if you read First Amendment law from the early days of movies, justices were debating, is a movie speech that's deserving of protection under the First Amendment? And now that's self-evident to us, right? Of course movies are speech. They're artistic expressions that are created by this team of people. But, you know, things like generative AI are asking us now to reckon with, like, is that speech? Is a Google search result based on their proprietary algorithm, is that a protected form of free speech? And I realize I'm taking this in a slightly different way, but, you know, again, thinking about, like, is Twitter, you know, are they a broadcaster? Are they a media company? Are they a technology company? Making all of those comparisons actually really matter, even if it seems like we're splitting hairs here, because that's how we regulate and that's how we make laws. And yeah, I mean, I don't have the answers here. People call for data transparency all the time, as Elizabeth said, thinking about what is in that black box of the algorithm, because as Lance said, you know, obviously things that are, you know, emotional, that are violent, grab attention, they go viral. And so the incentives to do the regulating on the social media platforms' behalf just aren't there. As the economists would say, like, the incentives don't line up here. And so regulation really needs to come from the outside. And I certainly don't know what it should look like, but I suppose my point is to try to make a point out of all of this is just recognizing that we're in a really strange space right now, and that thinking about like, what is it that social media platforms are doing? What is behind the curtain, to use a Wizard of Oz reference, is really important for thinking about what we do next.
I think to shift the conversation a little bit from what the platforms can do. One thing to recognize is that there are users of those platforms, and there's a lot that users can do or that can be done for users to help make transparent misinformation, disinformation. In this field of work, there's a couple of different stages that you can think of people who transmit disinformation. There's people who do it very intentionally, and then there's people who do it unintentionally. A lot of work has been done on that unintentional audience. And I think of that as like, I don't have an Aunt Bertha, so I'm going to say my Aunt Bertha sharing something on a social media platform of choice here. But she just shares it because it aligns with her viewpoint, right? So there's a whole theory in communication called inoculation theory that is very popular in a lot of disinformation research. And what it basically is, it's taking a health theory of, I'm going to inoculate you against the flu, let's say. And because I inoculate you, I'm going to keep everyone around you sort of safe. In disinformation, that means that if I can teach you to be able to identify or to know what to do to identify disinformation or misinformation, then I make the internet a little safer. One of the ways that I've approached this is mostly through games. So there's a whole plethora of games out there from everywhere from American University, right in our backyard here, to the Department of State, also in our backyard, but their games are for embassy usage, not for domestic usage, that focus on how we can help identify and train people to identify disinformation online when they encounter it in social media. So a lot of focus is on media literacy, which all ages benefit from. The other side of it is a part of that media literacy, understanding where the gaps are. So there was a game that was produced by American University called Factitious, and it was basically a hot or not of news that was real or news that was fake. That was based off of a database that another professor collected. They did a study of who was really good at collecting or identifying the fake information, who was really good at identifying the real headlines. And it turned out that people with higher degrees in education, such as PhDs or masters, were really good at identifying disinformation. My question is, why is that? And part of it is because all of us nerds on this panel right here have been trained to go through lots and lots and lots of sources and materials and be able to extract really quickly what is the vital information, what are the valid sources that it might come from, and really trying to figure out how can we very quickly identify those common themes. So that is one of the things that I think came from that study, is that by that higher training of literacy and information, that's one of the ways that we can help people identify disinformation.
So if I add, when the ChatGPT actually came out, which is November 2023, there was a lot of hype about whether actually ChatGPT like AI actually, which is not truly social media, but it is part of it, the ecosystem. So what the European nation actually did at the time, one nation, Italy, said that OpenAI, you cannot operate such a policy without any correction, when they actually said that there is a requirement. So they stopped of ChatGPT about 1 month in Italy, and one of the conditions that they could actually restore their services was public awareness campaign. So I think that that was a pretty good example of how much actually government could actually support literacy side of the issue, so that actually people actually detect much more better. I certainly agree that digital literacy is the one that actually we could actually think about as a kind of solution, and then I think the government should be actually supporting a lot of initiative.
Probably shocking to nobody that a group of doctors and journalists in communication think that literacy and more education is the key, but it actually is supported by evidence.
I will say, too, there's another study done by researchers at USC, and I mentioned this earlier based on the reward hypothesis. And they wanted to, kind of like Elizabeth was saying, kind of drill down into like, who are the people that are sharing fake news? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? And what they learned is that it's not that the people who are sharing misinformation or fake news are hyper partisan and like really kind of trying to drive a political point. Instead, they were mostly doing it to like get the likes and the reactions and the comments, whether they were in support or against. So they found that these people, when they studied their platform, were actually sharing things on both sides of the political aisle, just as a way, again, to get that dopamine hit of having people come to your page and to comment and that kind of thing. And so they did then an experiment study where they tried to incentivize people to do things differently. And so they created this like reward point system where people got reward points for sharing things that were accurate, not things that were outrageous and emotional and that kind of thing. And this was, I mean, it was a small experiment study, but they found that it worked, right? They were able to change people's behavior. And I think to me that speaks to that, again, this sort of constant reaction, instant gratification that we get from social media has like reshaped so much of what we want from those platforms. And, you know, whether you could roll that out on a big scale, well, no social media platform would allow you to do that, but sort of speaks to the fact that, like, if our brains have been wired for this, they can be wired against it, and we can shift incentives, potentially, I guess.
I mean, I think that's fine. I mean, I support it, but I don't know that that's enough. And, you know, there are many reasons for the economic struggles that journalism has faced over the last, you know, generation or so. But we see newspapers dying all over America in local newspapers, state newspapers. We see an absence of coverage of what's going on in these communities. And whatever their faults, journalists are trained to search for truth. And at the same time that journalism is, you know, shrinking, we see these technology companies, you know, minting profits in the billions of dollars, stealing the content of what journalists are left, you know, invulnerable to lawsuits the way journalists are because of how that's been written. And it just seems to me that we need some kind of regulation. You know, and you look 120 years ago to the Industrial Revolution, and there were all these abuses taking place by big corporations in the railroad industry, Standard Oil. And Theodore Roosevelt and the Trustbusters came in, and they passed all kinds of reforms that led to government regulations of these industries that had gotten out of control. So why aren't we seeing that happen today?
I would actually be really interested to hear you talk about what, because I agree with you 100% that the decline of news, the death of local newsrooms where everything is sort of covered from above, the shuttering of local papers is an incredible disservice to our democracy. And I have no doubt that all of this, as we think about social media's impact on our information ecosphere, is related. And so I guess, I mean, I have one unsatisfying answer, and then I would be interested to hear what you have to say about how we can solve and fix journalism, because I think it's so important. But I mean, sort of until we do, and absent Congress being willing to move on some other large scale regulations, I think we need whistleblowers, and I think, Frances Haugen was so important for doing that. I went to debate camp with her as a fun aside, way back in the early 2000s. But I mean, we need, just like, we've always relied on citizens with a conscience to speak truth to power. I mean, ideally we would have other agents like labor unions and other things that can push on the levers, but that's an unsatisfying answer, but that's one way where we get some information about what's actually going on in the black box of the algorithm.
I mean,
But I
I think
also
that's
do-
more education, right?
Yeah.
Whistleblowers supplying more information. I think we need more than that.
So one of the reasons why it's not happening, I think that is one example. Amazon actually several years ago purchased Washington Post, and right after that they moved their second headquarters in Virginia. For obvious reason to lobbying there. And many of company like Google and Facebook, they have all very nice office in around the DC area. But reason is clear. It's called capture theory. Industry actually capturing the government agency. They are actually supposed to regulate. So that's been actually going on. And the other part of it, I think that is user side, although local news is really important, but if you actually look at how much of the history of the public television, the rating has been low. Only someone like us, like nerd, actually watching some of the program. And many people actually, New York Times, as I understand, Washington Post and LA Times actually doing relatively better than before, though all the local newspaper actually dying out. So I think that those kind of psychology actually going into some of the concentrated newspaper well known because it is easy to find. I think that's the combination of why it's not happening.
Okay. I mean, I think, Washington Post is still losing about $100 million a year. And, there have just been recent cutbacks on even there. And that's when they have a billionaire, backing it up. The other newspapers are just gone. There's just so many places. So I don't know why we're not seeing regulation. There's been bipartisan rhetoric, on both sides of the aisle about, condemning the social media companies. I do think there's a free speech issue, right, and First Amendment problems that it runs into. Let me ask you this. How do you compare it with how the Europeans are regulating social media companies? How the U.S. compares?
So they actually been very active in legislating so-called against Silicon Valley. It has been very active in, especially last year, because of the ChatGPT and all the Google actually come up with their own the AI. So what they actually did is some of the requirement that actually put out the Silicon Valley, which is called as Digital Service Act. Which is actually regulating content moderation. So some of the information they actually found harmful to the minor, for example. If somebody actually complained about it, they're supposed to report what did they do, how long that content is available, and so on. So those kind of strict regulation, and it actually went on effect on February of this year. Not that they are actually ready for those kind of regulation about content moderation of the social media actually do. But they actually in a vision of what the social media should do, they have a clear vision about what the public interest should be. But nonetheless, difficult part of it, this one is, first, many U.S. scholars at the same time criticizing EU actually just come up with their legislation. Some of them actually suspect what they are doing is just to make sure the Silicon Valley not to as big as they do not want, because again Google search share is bigger than in the U.S. and Facebook and so on. So I think that some of the people actually raise the issue that whether actually they doing, whether they are actually doing just to check against the Silicon Valley companies. Nonetheless, I think that the public interest model that European actually has been always there from the BBC and all that.
I think cultures that are less hyper-capitalistic too, more of a sense of a common sphere. We are almost out of time. I want to just toss out, anyone want to make any predictions about the future of social media in the years and decades ahead?
I think social media is pretty much here to stay. I think where we're going to see shifts is a lot of the discussion that we've had today around our perceptions of privacy, our perceptions of data ownership. They're either going to solidify or still be open for discussion in cycles as more platforms come forward, more globalization of the platforms come forward. Because as I think that was a really good point, that a lot of the platforms we've talked about, not all, but a lot of the platforms we've talked about are US-based platforms. I don't know if that's necessarily going to continue to be the case. And one of the things that we're having to negotiate as countries is what do we do with these data sets that are worldwide? So that would be one prediction, is that we're going to keep talking about this, but I think there is going to be in the next couple of years a solidification of how we perceive and how we negotiate privacy online. How do we sort of as a culture also the literacy component, the journalism component. I think those going forward.
One thing that I'll say, this isn't really a prediction, but one thing that I am very interested to see how it plays out in the future is looking at, and I hope that there are people planning to do these sort of longitudinal, long-term studies of people who have grown up with social media. I think most of us in this room can remember a time when it didn't exist. Facebook, which was then thefacebook.com, came out the summer after my senior year of high school. And so I got on Facebook before I went off to college. And again, have sort of, as a scholar, as someone who likes researching and thinking about the world, have sort of also been observing all of these changes from above. But, I remember the time before they existed, and it will be interesting to see, both in terms of social norms, emotional well-being, mental health, educational attainment, whether there are kind of long-term impacts of being incredibly active on these sites from an early age. So that's just something I am musing about.
Well, I guess it's a gigantic real-time social experiment, and we'll find out only too late if there's a problem. Let's open it up for questions. Please, thanks to our panel here. Go ahead and pass the microphone around.
Yes, this one live. Good. I could take this one and come over to you.
Great.
Motto is truth in advertising, or truth in broadcasting. Okay? We don't hold them to the fire on this thing. How can we get away with it? How do they get away with it? And how do Well, I think one reason they get away with it is because we have a strong current for deregulation in this country, and business interest. National Association of Broadcasting is one of the biggest campaign contributors in the country to political candidates, and they have helped keep these kinds of reforms from happening, and they've kind of kept the FCC from getting too tough in its enforcement. So I think that's, one cause. It's basically our political system, which, is run by special interest money, makes it very hard to get the kind of regulation. And the social media companies, of course, are huge campaign donors in Washington.
I don't actually have an answer to the question, and I appreciate you jumping in since clearly you would know more about that. But one of the things that I do think that question makes me think about, and I think reminds us, or should remind us all, is that this question about social media specifically exists in a really broad media ecology, a world system of how we get and consume information. And so I really appreciate the perspective on local journalism and all of that, and thinking about cable news and all of that is absolutely part of a conversation about what are the impacts on our information world systems that we're consuming, and all of that, from like the Communications Decency Act, and all of that has an impact on social media. And, I suspect that the impacts that we have identified and spoken about a little bit about social media are amplified when we think about the other things that are happening across the media ecosystem as well.
This has been a great discussion. And thank you for bringing up truth. Yeah, because I was going to say, I think to continue that, I would definitely like your perspectives on, when we think about, there's certainly like the social media companies themselves, the media companies, but then there's actual individuals. So when we think about like truth, right, you all talked a lot about disinformation and things like that. It's a classic question. What is truth, right? And so when you think about individuals that are wanting to post information and wanting to communicate something, and we start talking about, censorship and things like that, when we're defining truth, how much do like values play into determining, what truth is? Because truth is typically, thought of as very binary, very black or white. The reality is that there's a values influence on what we determine as truth. So from that perspective, with those that are, all the billions of people, I guess, millions that use social media, what is going to be that threshold or norm of what gets constituted as disinformation versus truth when there's so much, I guess, a big aspect of that deals with values?
Yes, 100% yes. So as a rhetorical critic, which is my background, I analyze the persuasive impacts and appeals of messages. We always say rhetoric is constitutive. The language that you choose creates your worldview. Language is not a neutral tool to describe a world. Every word choice that you make is casting in a particular light what you're saying. And so I am very sympathetic to, and I realize the slippery slope of saying everything's relative, which it isn't, but I am very sympathetic to claims that we all see the world very differently, and we are constantly shaped by our values and our experiences and all of that. And so, I don't have necessarily an answer for your question, which is my refrain up here tonight. But one thing that, another sort of space in which I find some comfort and do some thinking and work is the depolarization space. And so I don't know if you've heard of organizations like Braver Angels, but they do work specifically in depolarization, and their goal is one-on-one conversations and helping people, because one of the things we know is that most of us live our lives in filter bubbles online, right? The algorithms show us what we want to see, but also very real silos. Most of us don't talk to people that disagree with us on a regular basis, which is one of the other reasons why social media discussions on politics go from 0 to 100 so quickly. And so I guess I take some inspiration from the depolarization work, which really seeks on an individual level to try to help people understand other people's experiences. And I'm reading a wonderful book by Monica Guzman right now, who is active in that space. And the book is called I Never Thought of It That Way. And her point is like having these conversations, and she provides specific tips for having tough conversations, think Thanksgiving dinner table kind of stuff, you know, that are just really focused on trying to understand the values behind what people say and recognizing that political beliefs come from long experiences, which doesn't mean you have to accept everything that people say. But for me, when we think about sort of content moderation on social media, I am sort of constantly tripped up by that exact question, right? The recognition that our truths do come from our experiences, and those look different for lots of different people. So, you know, if you're interested in thinking more about that, I might recommend kind of looking into the depolarization space and thinking a little bit more about how we can all do some work to try to talk to people who disagree with us. That can only have benefits across social media and our own personal lives.
I just have a really quick piggyback, and that is we framed the question as truth versus disinformation. And I think that it's really important to recognize that when we say disinformation, that is not just information that is false as a dichotomy to truth. Disinformation is a very targeted effort to create silos and rifts in society. It is weaponized information is a more accurate term. And it's not new in the way that our fields all come from to some extent propaganda research. I just want to be very careful when we're talking about disinformation, misinformation, those malinformation, those are specific terms about the weaponization of information online. Did you want to?
No, I mean, I agree with what everyone actually saying, because value determine what we actually see. And it's as you said, propaganda research actually figure out how selective our perception is. So it's very difficult to actually individual level how much actually information we detect is based on fact. That's a typical question.
Again, thank you, all of you. This has really been interesting. I just want to see if I'm understanding correctly about how this works in terms of, and also thinking about regulation. So there's the individual and the corporation. And so the individual pushes out a blog post or something that is clearly speech. The corporation, the companies all have algorithms that are deciding where that information goes. And then there's the Chat GPT, which is aggregating information from different sources that's not unique to an individual. So there must be different levels of speech and subject to different maybe levels of regulation. So I'm assuming that like the algorithm that would be commercial speech subject to a lower, more easily regulated. Is that probably correct? And is there, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, the commercial speech has been regulated pretty well, advertisement and so on. But algorithm, it defined as a commercial speech. I mean, algorithm is a mathematics formula, so it's hard to regulate what that is, and it's a proprietary the material, so they're not required to actually reveal what's actually going on. So whether it's actually constituted as commercial speech, if that is the case, I think that there will be powerful justification for some regulation, but as I understand, that has not been the case, right? It's much more like as just math. So how we actually regulate the math, they argue.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, I think, about whether that might be speech. Can I ask one more? So going back to what are norms and social norms and expectation, nobody mentioned the impact on the family. And I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about that.
Can I ask a follow-up? When you say the family, do you mean like connecting with family?
I mean, I think, Jennifer, you talked about expectations with strangers, but what about at home? On television, you see all the time children and even the parents sitting together, all looking at their phones.
So I'll take this as a first-time mother. There's a lot of tension within that circle in particular about the use of your phone or social media with children in particular. There's actually been some preliminary research that shows you need, like, the suggestion is to put your phone down when you're around your child. The other side of it is to recognize that parents are human and sometimes need a micro dopamine hit to survive a toddler tantrum. So I think there's a wide variation of what you can do within that context. I think more concerning from a privacy perspective for me, and that came up a lot in our discussion, is posting of your children online, giving pictures to the broader internet gods, as it were, of your child as they grow. There's a balancing act that you have to do, and that is, I have a lot of family that aren't local who can't see my kid very often. So I have reverted to this old-fashioned technology of text messaging for giving pictures and that sort of thing. But when I need to post, like, he's being really cute for Christmas, I'll post that online. I think there's a lot of benefits of social media and connectivity and in bringing families closer together. I do think that also is generally there's a caution with privacy and protecting a child's identity before they have a chance to even form it themselves. Sorry.
No, that's great. And, I don't have kids, so I can't really speak to that. Although I do, I see some of the stuff my friends post, and I'm like, when that kid turns 18, he's going to have some things to say about what you've been posting about him. But I really do believe in the value of social media for connecting with family that's far away and that kind of thing. But I also really believe that there is nothing more powerful than face-to-face interaction and being present in a space. And it's certainly the case that social media can make it hard to do that, right? I talk to my friends who have older kids, and they're like, man, they'd never look up from their phone from the second they get home from school. My parents have this rule when they go out to dinner with their friends that whoever looks at their phone the first while they're sitting around the table talking has to pay for the meal. I don't know whether they say they do this. I don't know whether they actually enforce it. But I do think, it is, even as we think not just about strangers, but interpersonally and with our close relationships, recognizing that those tools are both beneficial, but can also work against very real and important connections. It's a double-edged sword, as always.
If I add just one quickly, the Facebook at the beginning, actually, it has a very detrimental impact on the family, especially marriage. So some of the study actually found that the use of Facebook actually increased, divorce rate actually increased. So I will leave that. Well, I'm not sure if it's true anymore, but.
On that note of domestic bliss, thank you all for.
Thank you very, very much. This was really a very thought-provoking discussion. And you were talking about, I think that's why we created Great Talk, because Great Talk is with people, in the social media online, and that has the good points, but being, talking in front of people and, discussion is what it's all about. And I want to thank you so much for coming and having this discussion with us and just broadening the social media. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We do have, I just want to say, you could visit us at greattalk.org. We have more information. And we've had many talks that are posted on YouTube, and this one too we'll have listed on YouTube, and you can find out. We're a nonprofit. We always welcome donations for anyone who wants to give. And I want to thank our hosts again for having us. We couldn't have done it without you, and really appreciate it. And we do have nice refreshments in the back that have been gifted to us. So thanks again, and have a really good night.